Hello, welcome back. My name is Kimberly. I am the owner of So Sassy Stitcher in Northwest Arkansas. I am working on my own personal block of the month, working on Mountain Meadow. It's a kit I got from the Stitch and Snip in Garden Valley, Idaho, one of my absolute all-time favorite quilt shops. So I am working on block 2. This one is only like a 9-month block of the month. So working on block 2. So this particular quilt, I am changing quite a bit. So I am a big fan of making things as easy as possible, as precise as possible, with the least amount of effort. So that being said, I have a lot of changes on this particular pattern. So we have a lot of fabrics that we're working with. Again, I go through and I make sure that all of my fabrics are labeled before I get started pulling out those that I need. Being this particular pattern, I'm not just cutting up the whole thing at once. I'm cutting just what I need, trying to be careful that I don't end up running myself out of fabric. So if I need like 2 3-inch blocks, I'm not cutting a whole 3-inch strip. I'm just cutting like the 3 inches out of the corner, okay? Because I don't know what else I'm gonna need. I could have gone through and figured all of that out. I decided not to. I'm just doing it as I go. It generally has worked well for me in the past to do that, and it's generally not too much of an issue. I know that if I do run out, I'm gonna have a little bit of trouble finding the fabrics and may have to just do something that's close because this pattern is a couple of years old. So these fabrics probably don't exist anymore. Especially being batiks, they have certain batches, and even if it is something that is like the same fabric, if it's not in the same batch, the coloring could be just a little bit off, but that's a chance I'm willing to take. If you don't like that, you can go through and cut them all up. Part of the reason why I didn't just go through and cut everything is because I wanted to be able to really go through the pattern and change how I'm doing things. So, for example, we have half square triangles here. So they say to cut 4 7/8 for those fabrics to be able to make those half square triangles. I don't like to cut 8s, so I make it 5. Gives me a little bit of wiggle room to then trim up and square up. The other thing that I did is it says to cut them in half diagonally, okay? So that you get a triangle that looks like this. It'd be bigger because it's a 5-inch square, or a 4 7/8 inch square, and that one's not. But you would have it be that size, okay? And then cut it in half, and then you're gonna stitch along this. The problem that I have with that is that now I have a bias edge that I'm sewing along, which is going to cause stretch in here, and it's gonna make this whole thing a little wonky. So you can accomplish this same exact thing without the bias stretching by making a mark 1/4 inch on either side of that diagonal. So I have these little rulers from Fons and Porter that I've had for years and years and years and years, okay? And so I'm just gonna mark the wrong side of one of my squares, and this yellow line right here, I just put at each, make sure it covers each corner, and then I take my marker and I'm just gonna mark on either side of this. So that yellow line is the center, and then I'm marking a 1/4 inch on either side. You can do this with any ruler, okay? And I can just put the edge or the diagonal at the 1/4 inch points and mark along that edge, and then flip it around and do the same thing. This is just a little bit faster and easier to do that. So now that I have my pieces marked, then I can match them with the other piece. And the reason this works is because I'm doing the same thing for 8 of them. If I were doing one that had 2 and 4 and the next one had 3 and 6 or whatever, and it was different triangles, I would have to cut them in half. But because I have 8 of these that I need to do, I do 4 squares, or I have 4 that I need to do. And so I have 2 of each square because each square makes 2. And then I'm just gonna stitch along that line, both of those lines, and then I'm gonna cut right down the center, and I end up with this, okay? Now, because I cut 5 inches and not 4 and 7/8, when I open it up, I have a piece that looks like this, and now I can trim it down. There's a couple ways that you can trim this down. So I can open it up like this. I'm gonna put my diagonal right on that line. And I actually did half of this one earlier. And then I'm gonna cut along that edge, making sure that I still have 4.5 inches. Then I'm gonna flip it around. I'm gonna make sure that I'm lined up at 4.5 inches and that my diagonal is still on there. And then I'm just going to trim up that square, okay? So that's what I did for most of it. Now, there's another way that you can do this. So I have this one that I have not opened up yet. I have a really large, you can get them in different sizes. This is a 9.5 inch triangle square up ruler. So on one side it has halves, on the other side it has whole numbers. So this needs to be a 4.5 inch square. It'll be 4 inch finished, but for right now I need it 4.5 inches. So I'm going to take my 4.5 inch mark, and that is going to, I'm actually going to turn it this way so it's a little bit easier for me to cut. And I'm going to put that 4.5 inch line along my stitch line. Just like that. And you can see I have just the barest amount that I am going to cut off of both sides. Now, when I do open this back up, I am still gonna have my points. What I can do is, while I'm sitting here as this triangle, I'm just gonna do a little 45-degree trim on those corners so that when I open it up, those guys don't stick out, okay? So then I'll iron this towards the blue, and I have my 4.5 inch half square triangle. So you can trim them up the traditional way, or if you have your square up ruler, you can use that as well. It makes it a little bit faster because I'm just cutting 2 sides instead of 4, and I'm not having to spin and remeasure. So that does make that go a little bit faster. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to show you is our square in a square. So they have you making the square in a square the traditional way. There is a square in a square ruler that makes sure that it is a perfect square in a square and you don't cut off any points. So a typical square in a square, they have you do it in 1/8 increments. So for this one, we were cutting 4 7/8. Actually, that's not true. Let's look at number 1. They were doing 3 3/8. Okay, so with my ruler, so this is my square in a square ruler, or square squared ruler. Okay, so it's got a couple different parts to it, and I know it's hard to see against my cutting mat here. Let me scooch that out of the way a little bit so that you can see this better. There we go. Okay, so it has this part up here that is the size that you need to cut your inner square. Okay, and it will tell you cut from 2-inch strips, cut from 2 3/4 inch strips, or whatever. Okay, and it tells you what dimension to cut for what size of finished block. this particular ruler is only for even numbered finished blocks, so 1 to 6. Okay, now on the other side, I have this kind of weird grid pattern that I am going to explain in a minute. So what you want to do is you want to take your square, and your square, I'm going to use a slightly different one. I'm going to use one of these so that you can actually see what I'm talking about, because I've already put these together. So what I'm going to do is I have my inner square, okay? I'm going to, so if I needed a 4-inch finished, and our bigger one is a 4-inch finish, it's supposed, when you get this square and a square done, it's going to be 4.5 inches. However, when we put it in our system, in our block, it's going to finish at 4 inches. So I'm looking for 4-inch finished square. Okay, so I'm going to put it, my line up right here on this 4-inch finished block. Okay, and then I would trim off the rest of that. Okay, because when you do it to 1/8 of an inch, it's actually still a little too big. But you're not going to do a shy eighth or anything like that because it's too variable. So this gives you an exact center measurement. Then from there, I'm going to take my triangles that I created earlier. Again, I tend to do them a little bit bigger. However, on this, and this gives you wiggle room to trim up. So on our square squared right here, it gives us what size of triangles we need to cut. So for my 4-inch finished, I need to cut a square that's 3.25 inches, and then I'm going to cut that in half diagonally. And so that's what I did. And you can see on blocks 5 and 17, I changed my directions to cut 3.25 inch squares instead of 2 7/8 inch squares. Because what's going to happen if you cut 2 7/8 inch squares and you put it on your 3 3/8 inch block, what is likely going to happen, because you're sewing on the bias, is you're going to end up with a square that's not really square. You're going to end up wonky. It's going to end up short. You're going to be really frustrated with it. So I'm going to put my triangles on. Now at this point, I am going to check and make sure that my measurements are correct. So that's where this side of this ruler comes in, and it looks a little funky, but what I'm looking at is I want the 4-inch right here. And so it's got this X and a 4. So the X's go on what will be the corners of our inner box. And then you've got a dashed line in between all of them. And so I should have, since I don't have pieces here yet, I should have a 1/4 inch of my block still sticking out past those dotted lines for my 4. Okay, then I have this one lined up on, and this dotted line that's running right along my seam line. If I go to the other side, this triangle should also be running right along that diagonal line, and it is. And so if I look at this and I have one that maybe I have, maybe it comes up and is just a little bit off and it sits like this, I can go back in and I can fix my seam to make sure that I have this. Or maybe I sewed a too scant of a 1/4 inch, and so the whole thing is too wide. Or maybe I sewed not a scant 1/4 inch, and so now my triangle is down here. Well, that's going to throw the whole thing off. So I can check at this point and see if I need to adjust any of my triangles. And then I can proceed, that one's good, so I can proceed to adding my triangles. So I've added my triangles. And with these guys, you want to mark, I iron them, my center block, so that I have a middle point. and I have these lines so that when I lay my triangles down, I'm laying that triangle in the center of that block. So when you've added all your blocks, this is what you end up with, okay? Then I'm gonna iron that open, just like this, and then I am going to do the same thing, and I'm gonna lay this ruler down, and those X's should sit right at the corner, all four corners right here for the 4, okay? And now you can see that my block is too big, okay? So I'm gonna use this ruler to square it up. I'm gonna move it back onto my cutting mat. Okay, so again, I'm gonna make sure that this is lined up so that those 4 X's are at those 4 junctions. Just like that. And then I can use this, and I have 2 sides trimmed up, and you can see I still have a good 1/4 inch right here, so that when I add this to the next piece, I'm gonna stitch right here, and so I will still have my point, and I won't cut off my points, and I won't have floating points, because that's the other thing that some squares will do, is that you have more than a 1/4 inch right here, and so you end up with kind of this floating block that you shouldn't have. So now that I have one side trimmed up, I have this line right here that's a 4.5 inch line, so I don't have to worry about these points. I can just line up this. Now, that being said, these should also match up when you put it back on those lines. And then I can trim this up. And again, if this was not correct when I put those last 2 triangles on, I'm just gonna fix that seam so that I get that perfect squareness square. Now, that being said, so this is for the big block that we're doing. For our 2B block, it is a 2.5 inch finished, okay? So I can do it their traditional method. I don't want to do that. So it's going to be, your traditional method's going to be the same thing. I'm going to do it the same exact way that I did this one. I'm going to take my square, I'm going to add sides opposite and then sides opposite, and then I'm not going to have anything to trim up if I do it their way. So I am ordering a square squared that is 1/2 inch measurements. So it's going to have a 1.5 inch block, a 2.5 inch block, a 3.5 inch block, etc., so that I have the other sizes, because this is something that I do use fairly frequently when I'm putting blocks together. So it is something that I will appreciate having. If you don't have the square squared ruler, you can either choose to get them from your local quilt shop or online, or you can do it the traditional method. I would recommend oversizing your triangles, not your inner block, but your triangles, so that you have a little bit to be able to square up when you are finished, okay? Because your 1/4 inches should be the same, but that gives you a little bit of wiggle room in the squaring up so that you can actually end up with a square block to put in with the rest of it versus a wonky block. So those are the biggest changes that I did. So you can see on my instructions, make sure you can actually see it there. So fabric 1, I did 5 inches and I did not cut it in half. And then I did 3.5 inch squares for the square and a square instead of the 3 3/8. Fabric 3, I'm doing a 2.5 inch square for the square in a square, and that one I am going to go ahead and cut diagonally once. This is going to make my smaller square in a square, so I did verify that this is the correct size. If you want to use a square in a square, even if you don't use that square in a square, I would still cut it at least 2 1/4, if not 2 3/8, to give yourself a little bit of extra wiggle room to be able to trim that guy up. The 3 by 3 squares are fine. That's for the border that we're doing. All right, fabric 4, I'm cutting again the 5-inch square instead of 4 7/8. I'm just rounding that up. I'm not cutting it diagonally so that I can put it together as I showed you. Then the 3-inch squares are fine. And then I'm going to the 2 1/4-inch squares. I'm bumping up to 3 inches for that fabric 4. And actually, that one does not need to be that large. That one really only needs to be about 2 1/2 is what that one needs to be. So I would bump that up to 2 1/2 because that's the center here. And it doesn't need to be 3 inches. I was guessing, I did verify that. So cut it at 2 1/2 inches, and then you're going to trim it up. If you are doing it the traditional method, you are going to want to keep this at 2 1/4. Fabric 5, I cut, that's for these here. It's going to be 3 1/4 inches. So I am bumping that up a little bit, but it's well worth that trimming. Fabric 9 is the same. Fabric 10, I'm cutting 3 1/2-inch squares instead of 3 3/8, and I'm not cutting them diagonally. And because that's for these half square triangles. Fabric 13, again, I'm cutting at 2 1/2 inches, and I am cutting them diagonally once. That's for our square in a square. Fabric 14, there's no changes. Fabric 15, I'm bumping that up to 5 inches instead of the 4 7/8. The 4 1/2 stays the same. Fabric 17, I'm swapping the 2 7/8 to a 3 1/4, and I am going ahead and cutting. Again, that's for the block that I just showed you, that square in a square. Fabric 20 stays the same. Fabric 23, I'm taking the 3 3/8 and I'm bumping it up to 3 1/2. And again, I'm not cutting that one in half. 3 by 3 stays. And then the last fabric, fabric 24, I'm going to again bump up to 5 from 4 7/8, and I'm not cutting it. So then once I have all of those done, then I can put them together. So I've started doing that. So I have my first row, just like that. That's going to be my top row here. And I followed the ironing directions. If you iron away from your blue triangles towards the solid ones, it's going to make those easier. We do want those nestled seams. And so on the next row down, you actually have 2 half square triangles right next to each other. So you can see I have that here. I'm still going to iron away from my blue triangle because when I put that together, that'll nestle up. Now with, make sure okay, so this is actually going to be this one. So when I put those together, even though it doesn't really matter that much, these seams nest together by ironing them towards the darker fabric. Those nestle together, so they're going to lay nice and flat when you put them together and sew here. And then when I open it up, you're not going to have a big bulky seam because this isn't under as well. So it's going to keep your seam a little bit flatter by doing that and having those nestled seams. So pay attention to what direction you are ironing. And then I'm going to go ahead, now that I have my square in a squares done, I can go ahead and put the rest of this together. The blocks are the same, they're just slightly different colors and different sizes. So one you're gonna have 3-inch squares, the other one you're gonna have 4.5-inch squares to put together into that block. So we're gonna have one big block, one smaller block. And then we also have this spacer. This is real simple, easy peasy, just 5 3.5-inch blocks that we're putting together for that spacer. But we do wanna make sure that we get that done. All right, so when I get my half square squared, I will come back and I will show you that piece of it as well, so that you can have another go at that one and make sure that you're doing it correctly for that. Again, if you don't have that ruler, that's fine. You can do it the traditional method, but I do recommend still oversizing your triangles so that you have that wiggle room to be able to cut that down. And you can always make sure that you have that 1/4 inch and adjust your seams as needed before you trim it down. I hope this helps you out. I've still got, you know, some sewing to do to finish out this block of the month, but I hope that helps you out. You've learned a couple new rulers this time, and it really does make our sewing a little bit easier and our piecing more precise, which is nice because I really hate cutting off tips of my points. So happy quilting. I hope that wherever you're at, you are having beautiful weather. We are having a snow day tomorrow, so I'm gonna hang out in my quilt room and do some more stuff and hopefully stay warm. Happy quilting, everyone.